The English gentlemen of Gothic horror make one hell of an impact on this episode of Deadly Duos. You may not know the names Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing off the top of your head, but I would wager they have had an impact on every cinema-watching generation since the 1950s. Between them, they have tackled Shakespeare and Sherlock Holmes, Doctor Who and James Bond, Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, both new and old. Had they been alive during the current Marvel juggernaut, they would have certainly been included somewhere in that universe. And no, we aren't counting the 1970s TV Captain America 2, Death Too Soon, even if Lee is undoubtedly the best part. Their biggest contribution, however, and the one that is very near and dear to my heart, is the many, many horror films they did both together and separately. Christopher Lee was born in Belgravia, London in May of 1922. Throughout his younger years, he would move from country to country and school to school, learning various languages and trade tools to help him out in his life. His parents divorced, and his mother would later marry the uncle of James Bond creator Ian Fleming, making the two boys step-cousins. He would eventually make his way to military school, and that would lead him to joining the actual military in 1939. From the Royal Air Force to the precursor of the British SAS, Lee was well-traveled in the military and never gave away too many details of his time, though a famous anecdote from Lord of the Rings director Peter Jackson, where Lee told him the proper sounds of a man being stabbed in the back, tell us that Lee was probably closer to the real James Bond than any of the actors who have portrayed him. After retiring from the military in 1946, his acting career and lifelong friendship with Peter Cushing would begin with 1948's Hamlet, starring and directed by Laurence Olivier. Peter Cushing was born in May of 1913 in Surrey, England. While his family moved at an early age as well, the Cushing family's move was due to fear during World War I. When he was finally settled after the war, he fell in love with the acting profession by watching, of all things, American Western star Tom Mix. This encouraged him to go to acting school and eventually make the leap to moving to Hollywood, where he thought he would become an international success. While he didn't end up becoming a huge star, he ended up in a small role in The Man in the Iron Mask from horror icon James Whale and the Laurel and Hardy film A Chump at Oxford. When nothing really materialized in Hollywood, Cushing would move back to England and get sought out by Olivier to appear in his soon-to-be Best Picture-winning screen version of Hamlet. While 1948's Hamlet would win Best Picture at the Academy Awards, it would not launch the duo into stardom. In fact, there was very little for them to do afterwards except for minor parts, including their next two collaborations, 1952's Moulin Rouge and Alexander the Great in 1956. Finally, it would take Hammer Studios, then known for swashbuckling pirate adventures and detective fare, to make the leap into full-color horror with the first of what is truly a holy trinity in horror, 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein. President of Hammer Films Jimmy Sangster would cast Cushing as the eponymous Mad Doctor, with Lee lined up as his creation. For those that may not know, Hammer Studios became an absolute powerhouse in horror from the late 50s and into the 70s, very much akin to New Line Cinema, Lionsgate, Blumhouse, and, where they drew their most inspiration from, the Universal Monster series. The Curse of Frankenstein was an absolute smash success for both the studio and the two stars. The film pulled in $8 million on a $200,000 budget and gave the cinema world gory color versions of the black and white Universal classics, while most of the genre entries of the era were sci-fi monsters and films dealing with the fear of a nuclear age. It would also give us, in my opinion and others, the definitive portrayal of Dr. Frankenstein with Peter Cushing.
We've discovered the source of life itself, and we've used it to restore a creature that was dead.
Lee does a fine job as his creation, but Cushing steals the show here. While the two wouldn't collaborate on any more Frankenstein films, Cushing would go on to play the role an additional 5 times, giving the character more depth and madness with each turn. The duo, who had worked on 3 films together prior, became best friends during the making of Frankenstein and would remain that way until Cushing's death in 1994. Next would be the Hammer version of Bram Stoker's most infamous work. The Horror of Dracula would release the following year in 1958, and much like Curse, give cinema goers a couple things. First, it would be a huge success with a $3 million take on only an $80,000 budget. And second, it would give us what is to many the ultimate portrayal of Count Dracula, as portrayed by Christopher Lee. He was physically imposing, suave, menacing, and added a gothic romanticism to the role missing from previous incarnations. Much like his best friend and the character of Frankenstein, Lee would play Dracula a whopping 10 times, and I still get goosebumps when Cushing's Van Helsing and Lee's Count face off at the end. 1959 would bring 2 more collaborations, both from Hammer Studios. The duo would star in an adaptation of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes story, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Cushing would appear here as the main detective, with Lee playing Henry Baskerville. The story follows Holmes and Watson investigating the death of Holmes's friend, Charles Baskerville, and the apparent curse on the Baskerville name. It is a fun adaptation and a departure from the gothic horror of their previous collaborations, Both Cushing and Lee would go on to play the world's best detective a number of times throughout their career. Elsewhere in 1959 would be the release of the final film in the duo's trilogy of Universal Classic remakes with The Mummy. Lee would again take to playing the silent stalking monster like he did in Curse of Frankenstein, while Cushing would play the part of John Banning, one of the archaeologists unlucky enough to unearth the tomb of Princess Ananka and revive her mummified priest. While not a defining role for either actor, it is still a wonderful update to the classic story and gave the duo and Hammer Studios another successful tale. While the duo would work together on The Devil's Agent in 1962, Cushing's scenes were deleted. 1964 would give us yet another tale from Hammer with The Gorgon. The story follows the character of Paul Heitz, played by Richard Pascoe, investigating the mysterious deaths of his brother and father, with his mentor played by Lee. Cushing gets the rare bad guy turn here as the doctor who knows the truth of the mysterious deaths, but tells everyone it is simply heart failure. The Gorgon is a fun slice of mythological horror, with the monster being a mythical gorgon that turns its victims to stone, and I recommend it to any Hammer fan. The next year would give us the duo's first foray into Hammer's chief studio rival, Amicus. Amicus specialized in anthology horror, with nearly all of their output being of that variety, and Dr. Terror's House of Horror is one of their most famous. It follows 5 passengers on a train getting their fortunes told by Peter Cushing's Dr. Schreck, all with terrifying results. Christopher Lee plays one of the passengers, with his story being an art critic who drove an artist to suicide, and being tormented by his disembodied hand. The story would later be turned into a feature called, The Hand, from Brian De Palma of all people. Later in 1965 were 2 more films. Yeah, these guys were busy. The Lost City exploration flick She, and the Skullploitation? Yeah, I'm making that subgenre up. Film The Skull. She follows a team of explorers led by Cushing's Professor Hawley into the lost city of Kuma to discover what secrets it holds. Lee plays a high priest seeking immortality and will stop at nothing to get it. The Skull is a supernatural tale of the Marquis de Sade's skull haunting anyone who possesses it, with Lee's character Matthew Phillips having it first, only to escape its madness before the skull ends up in the collection of Cushing's Dr. Maitland. The film is based on a short story by Psycho author Robert Bloch. Well, I guess they can't all be winners. Both films are very watchable examples of 60s English sci-fi horror. 2 years later would bring us the next entry from the duo. They both appeared in episodes of The Avengers, again, not those Avengers, the original Avengers, that year, but their film entry would be Night of the Big Heat, or Island of the Burning Damned as it was released in the US a few years later. The film follows guests at an English countryside hotel dealing with the worst heat wave ever while the mainland is in a deep winter freeze, and there are warning signs to be discovered of something much more worrisome than just weather. Lee plays the lead scientist who figures out the cause, with Cushing as a different scientist who discovers their fates far too late. It is a criminally underseen film, as it has had no real North American release, that feels like a mixture of Doctor Who and The Twilight Zone. 1970 would bring 2 additional films together for Lee and Cushing, with bit parts in the Jerry Lewis comedy One More Time as Count Dracula and Baron Frankenstein, respectively.
You got real monsters, my lord, in your cellar. Real monsters. I've seen them all in the movies.
And the decidedly more horror-tinged film Scream and Scream Again. The latter is really less of a horror film and more a science fiction thriller, but it is notable for being the first film to feature Lee, Cushing, and another horror legend, Vincent Price. The film has 3 fragmented storylines that eventually end up together, and probably deserves multiple viewings to fully digest. Not a classic, but a notable film in their collaborative efforts. 1971 gave us, yet again, 2 movies that they worked on together. Man, what a life! Getting to make horror movies for almost 2 decades with your best friend? We should all be so lucky. Anyway, the 2 films are I, Monster, which is a new take on the classic tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and The House That Dripped Blood, which is another solid anthology film from Amicus Studios. In I, Monster, Lee gets to play the Jekyll character and his dual personality of Hyde, while Cushing plays his friend and lawyer who slowly figures it all out. It is a fun take on the classic story, and always fun to see the duo play off each other, rather than just exist in the same film. House That Dripped Blood has Cushing in the second segment about a retired stockbroker visiting a wax museum. Definitely nothing scary there. And Lee's installment has to do with witchcraft. Their segments are 2 of the best in an anthology that is pretty solid all around. 1972 gives us, shockingly, 2 more films. Dracula AD 1972 not only has the strangest title in the Hammer Dracula series, but is also the return of Peter Cushing to the series as the Van Helsing to Lee's Count. It's flawed, it's dumb, but it's a heck of a lot of fun to see them battle each other 14 years after their first appearance as the characters. The other entry is a very interesting horror film called Horror Express, that in addition to Cushing and Lee, also has a small role for Telly Savalas. What I didn't know until I rewatched it recently is that it is also based on John W. Campbell's short story Who Goes There, which later became the Carpenter classic The Thing. You can really only tell that it's an adaptation once you know, because the connections are fringe at best. Still, it's a really fun movie with creepy moments and a very eerie score. The very next year would give us, oh, you gotta be kidding me, 4 more? Did these guys do anything else with their time? First up is an appearance together on an episode of Orson Welles' Great Mysteries, something I didn't know existed and could not find any of it to watch. In addition to that, we had the features Nothing But the Night, The Creeping Flesh, and The Satanic Rites of Dracula. The Creeping Flesh has Cushing and Lee as brothers who discover skeletal remains that are really an unstoppable evil force. It is a strange tale that is fun to watch the two play off each other, but it's otherwise a confusing mess. Nothing But the Night is a lone movie by Christopher Lee's production company, Charlemagne Pictures, and it's an Agatha Christie-like tale of murder rather than a straight horror film. The final film that year would also be the final appearance for the two men in a Hammer production together. There would be no Hammer without Lee and Cushing, and there would probably be no Lee and Cushing, certainly the way we know them today, without Hammer. The Satanic Rites of Dracula is the final showdown between Cushing's Van Helsing and Lee's Count Dracula, here posing at first as a powerful businessman who plans to release a plague on mankind. It kind of feels like Dracula by the way of James Bond, and while it doesn't completely work, their scenes together are an awful lot of fun. It would be 6 years later until their next collaboration, the non-horror film Arabian Adventures from 1979, and then 1983 would be The House of the Long Shadows, the pair's final collaboration. House of the Long Shadows is a horror mystery that isn't a notable film, but it is notable as the aforementioned final pairing of Lee and Cushing, and also brings in horror legends Vincent Price and John Carradine to pal around with the two. It's the simple story of a writer being challenged to complete a novel in 24 hours, and to get his creative juices flowing visits an old spooky manor that happens to have old spooky people in it. Cushing would only appear in 5 more movies before his death in 1994, while Lee would go on to have a legendary resurgence and continue acting up until his death in 2015. The duo would remain the best of friends until Cushing's death, and Lee would fondly remember him 2 decades on. I would also be remiss if I didn't recommend the solo efforts for each, so for Cushing, also seek out his role in Star Wars A New Hope and CGI him in Rogue One, in addition to Brides of Dracula, his 2 Doctor Who movies, and 1972's Tales from the Crypt. For Lee, The Wicker Man is essential horror viewing, as well as his Herculean effort making the Star Wars prequels watchable, and as a rare good guy in the Hammer classic The Devil Rides Out. Honestly though, with over 400 roles between the two men, you can't go wrong picking anything. Thank you for watching our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our JoBlo Horror Videos channel. Tell your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all your support.